Everybody, it's great to be back here again tomorrow. It's Friday, Parashat Bahalotcha. When I was reading this week's portion, I was bewildered. The opening begins with the story of lighting the menorah in the temple. And I was saying to myself, wait a second, the temple lighting the menorah, what does it have to do with the whole book of Numbers? What does it have to do with our portion? It seems to be so out of place. Obviously, it's the natural location would be in the book of Exodus. But there were 4 portions that deal with the building of the tabernacle. So why was it repeated? By the way, it's mentioned there. So it was repeated again in our portion. Obviously, there is a very, very special reason, and I want to try to answer that question in this Torah lesson. And in addition to that, there is also something that's very out of place, and that is the 2 verses in chapter 10, verse 35 and 6, where they're famous verses where Moshe Rabbeinu says to God, when the ark was traveling, that God should go to get up and have the enemies scatter, and when the ark would come back, Moshe Rabbeinu prays to Hashem that God should reside His presence again on Israel. And those 2 verses, the Talmud says, are out of place, and therefore it's like a portion of its own, and they have the backward, upside down letter Nun to show that it's out of place. So we have 2 parts of the portion that are out of place, and what are they doing here? And it's connected to the answer I'm going to try to give relating to the menorah. And that's 2 questions here. The third question is a word. Well, I'm sort of giving you background to try to understand my punchline at the end. There's also very important, I teach you, I'll mention it very quickly, is that when a word is mentioned over and over again in a portion in the Torah, there's no doubt a very, very deep lesson behind it. In this week's portion, there's a root that's brought so many times, I can't imagine any other portion of the Torah that this root is so prominent. And that's called asaf, to gather. The gathering. And we're going to see how that relates as well to the answer. And before we begin, I want to mention that the portion is extremely, it's bipolar. It begins with such happy events, describing, again, as I mentioned before, the tabernacle, lighting the tabernacle, the menorah, which is such a happy event. What could be more greater than in our temple lighting candles? And talks about afterwards the Levites sanctifying them for their service in the temple. Again, temple service. Such a happy event. Levites would sing. They would guard the gates. Pesach Sheni. The next one is the second Passover option. Who was not happy when they have a second chance? Another very happy event. And then we have the clouds of glory, where they would lift off the up, and then Israel would know they would have to travel. So that was a great thing to have divine providence. Every time they would travel, they'd have a cloud of glory. That was their way. He's guarding them. And after that, we see about the chatzotzrot, the trumpets. The trumpets were a tremendous blessing for Israel, because God would remember them in when we went to battle, and in addition when we had our festivals. So that's also such a happy thing. And then the portion speaks about the traveling in the desert by the camps, which is our very organized fashion of movement and order, which is a fascinating thing, how we traveled in unison, in unity. And then from there on, things begin to change. And we see where Moshe Rabbeinu turns to his father-in-law and says, don't leave us. So it's very sad. His father-in-law wants to go back to his father's home, and he wants to separate from Israel, and that's painful to Moshe. I spoke about that in one lesson. He does come back, but that's an important thing to mention as well. So that's a sad event, but that's nothing compared to the continuation. The Torah begins to reveal to us the complaints. The nation was complaining about the situation, and Ramban Nachmanides explains, in very profound words. He says, they should have been so happy to walk with Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert with happiness with God and b'tuv levav and upright heart from all the good that God has done for us. Instead, what are they doing? They're complaining about the situation. That's a terrible response to what the blessing that God has done for Israel. And that's one of the first, one of the first mentions of crises that take place after Jethro leaves this crisis, and then we have another one. What is the other one? the Asafsuf, the Erev Rav, coming and saying, I remember the wonderful things we ate in Egypt. and they were talking about the avatiach, they were talking about the garlic, the gefilte fish. They were so excited about that, they began to complain that they don't have this anymore. They have to eat the man. They were complaining that the man, which we know was a false complaint, because the man was able to give any taste you wanted. And so that was again another very, very sad event. And the sad events continue. What is the next one? We all know Moshe Rabbeinu was always out there to defend Israel, to speak up for Israel. But here we see in chapter 11, verse 10 to verse number 15, a very, very unusual response by Moshe Rabbeinu. And I want to even stress and mention some of this here, because this is so painful. We'll get back to these verses, and because it has to do with the answer to our question. And if we go on, I'll quickly mention a couple of other situations that, just to wrap up the idea, we all know about the very, very tragic situation of Moshe Rabbeinu, where his brother and sister spoke about him, Lashon Hara, and then Miriam was punished and she was put away for 7 days. And so these events of the beginning of the portion, and we compare them to the latter part of the portion, it's like literally two different sides. It's literally happiness and sadness. So what does that mean? How does that connect to everything we said? Now, in order to answer the question that I opened up with the menorah, and we'll get back to wrapping it all, to putting it all, threading it together. So the menorah, we all know, has 7 branches. And if we look in this week's portion, we see these 7 branches come up a few different times. So it's sort of a thread that connects the whole portion together. What are the branches? Well, if we look, and I said just a minute, I'm going to talk about it, when Moshe Rabbeinu's unusual response, what did he respond to? It's chapter 11, verse 10. I'd like to read to you some of these verses. It says, Vayishma Moshe ta'am boche lemishpachotav. Moshe Rabbeinu heard Israel crying to its family. Ish lefetach olo, everyone at the entrance of their tent. And then it says, Vayicharaf Hashem ma'od, God got very angry. And it says, Ubeinei Moshe Ra, and it's very, very, in the eyes of Moshe Rabbeinu, this is a terrible thing. And then we see Moshe Rabbeinu's response. What does Moshe Rabbeinu say? Vayom Moshe el Hashem, Moshe says to God, Lama ri'ot lavdecha, why did you bring me this, why do you make this, brought this badness upon me? V'lama lo matzati chen beinech, why didn't I find favor in your eyes to place this burden of the entire nation upon me? Hanochi ariti et kol hamazeh, did I give birth to this nation? That you're going to tell me to carry him in my chest like a person carries a child? And Moshe Rabbeinu says, where am I going to get all this meat to feed them? And then he goes on to say, Lo uchal anochi levadi l'seit et ha'am hazeh ki kaved mimeni. I'm not going to be able to bear with this nation. It's too heavy for me to bear this nation. And God says, if this is going to be, Moshe says to God, if this is going to be the situation, kill me, God. It says, Hogeni naharog im matzati chen beinecha ve'al ere berati. Don't see me in this bad state. This is a very unusual reaction by Moshe Rabbeinu. I've never seen such a harsh reaction. Even when Israel sinned with the golden calf, Moshe Rabbeinu's reaction was different. He defended Israel. Here he seems to be lifting his hand saying, I can't deal with it. Very unusual. What happened? Why is Moshe Rabbeinu responding in such a harsh way? And what happened here when they were crying to the families, it was a continuation. Before they were crying over meat, and Moshe Rabbeinu was sort of responding to both of the complaints. But this sort of set it off totally. And the crying to the families here, our rabbis explain, refers to the fact that Israel was upset with, now that the Torah was given, that certain prohibitions were added on to them in their matter, who they're allowed to marry. I'm not going to go into the details here of all those details now. That would be just a lesson in itself. But I just wanted to show that we see Moshe Rabbeinu's very unusual response. And what does God say, which is fascinating? How does Hashem relate to all this? What is God's response? And that I want to show right away. God says to Moshe Rabbeinu something. He says, gather me 70 elders. Right? What is the word? I want to find the word, the exact words. I'd like to read those. What does Hashem say to Moshe Rabbeinu? He says like this. It's brought down in chapter 11, verse number 16 and 17. Vayomer Hashem and Moshe, God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Esfali shivim ish, gather me 70 people from the elders of Israel. And then he goes on to say, I'm going to come down and talk to you there. Sham v'atzalti min haruach asher alecha. I'm going to place my spirit on you upon them as well. And so here we see that the number, God says to gather, what does he say to Moshe Rabbeinu? I want you to gather 70 elders, correct? 70 elders. 70 right away connects to what? Connects to the 7 branches of the menorah, of the candelabra in the temple. Because 7 and 70 are related, as we all know. It's the same number, it's just removing the 0 and gematria katan. So we see the 70 coming up again, or the 7 coming up again over here, and when God tells Moshe to gather the 70 elders. Now, Rashi says something fascinating, another connection to the menorah, which I was saying. What does Rashi say? Rashi brings down a beautiful explanation where, as we all know, if Moshe Rabbeinu God now was going to place His Spirit upon the other elders now, besides Moshe Rabbeinu, one may say is that perhaps Moshe Rabbeinu is going to lose some of his power, because if he's going to give part of that Spirit on the 70 elders, Moshe Rabbeinu will no longer have that Spirit. Have the Spirit, but have less than he had beforehand. But that's really where Rashi brings out a very nice mashal, a very nice example, where he says like this. He says, what is it likened to? It's like a candle. And if you take a candle, you could continue, that candle continues to burn, you can light other candles from it. And it still gives off its light. So that beautiful mashal of Rashi is saying that Moshe Rabbeinu is going to obviously continue to have his power that he had, that great leader of a prophet, but he's going, and he's not going to be in any way hindered by the fact that others received a special light to be able to become judges. So it's really connects us to the lighting of a candle, right? When you're lighting a candle in a room, many people can enjoy that same light in that room. When there's light lit up in the room, everyone enjoys that same light. So it's very, very beautiful. So here we see another connection to 7. And finally, I'll bring you another connection to the 7 branches of the menorah. Well, here's the connection again to the menorah, another connection to the menorah. Another connection we see at the end of the portion where Miriam, after she spoke evil about her brother, Lashon Hara. Of course, on that level, he's a great righteous people, but she was punished for it. What does the Torah say? It says that she was put out of the camp for 7 days. 7, whoop, the number comes up again. 7 branches of the menorah, the 70 elders of Israel. The 7 days Miriam was outside the camp. But here, of course, it's referring to, being a punishment. 7 being out of the camp for 7 days. But the number 7 comes up, and I want to show you in a moment how that connects to the candle, to the menorah in the temple, the candelabra. So let's begin now the explanation. If we go back to what I said at the opening, that the word asaf, to gather, is extremely prominent in the portion. And it means literally, the word asaf means lesof, to gather. In the Torah, we all know the name Yosef comes from the same root of gathering, right? So it's a very common word. But this week's portion, it's particularly extremely common. It's over and over again. And it begins when we're talking about, I want to mention one powerful expression of the word here, asafsuf. Asafsuf. Those that gather together in the air of Rav to make trouble, complaining about the man that they were tired of. They wanted to go back to the food of Egypt. They wanted a different menu. Asafsuf is literally the word asaf doubled. Taking the word aleph samach pei, you double it, asafsuf, it's twice. So that's one very, very powerful example. It stands out. When God tells Moshe Rabbeinu to gather, right? Asaf. Asaf means to gather the 70 elders, that same root is brought down. To gather again, as sort of a response to the Asaf Suf. Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, we said he responded very harshly. So God told him to gather the 70 elders. Lasofotam. That same thing. Regarding Miriam, it says afterwards, when she was Vayasef Miriam, afterwards she was regathered to her back to the camp. She was put out of the camp, but then later on she was gathered back again. That same root is used at the end of the portion, reflecting Miriam being regathered to the camp. So what is this whole concept of asaf? And there are so many more examples, which I can mention, but again, the time is short. I just want to give you look it up. You can see yourself, if you're reading the original Hebrew, how many times it's brought down. So what does this concept mean? How do we connect to this? Well, there are two sides, and the whole function is of the menorah is to symbolize our unity. That we're all branches focused on, centrally focused. And what do I mean by that? We all know that the menorah and the tabernacle and the temple was in the south. And if we understand that the menorah stood from the direction of east to west, from north to south, so all the candles were facing the Holy of Holies, the curtains of the Holy of Holies. But we know there was this essential candle, or a candle known as the Western, it's known as the Ner HaMaravi, the Western candle. From that candle, all the other candles were connected in that. They all were lit from that candle, and they all faced that candle. So what does that represent? Well, the central candle would literally represent the candle that is responsible for leadership, right? That's sort of like gathering up all the other candles are facing towards that candle, and that candle in turn faces towards the Holy of Holies, and there the divine presence resides in the temple through that process, right? The light that shines in our temple will shine to the entire world, right? That's how it's known that the temple was the light of the entire world. That's being a light to the nations. So Israel, if they realize coming out of Egypt, we have a chazon, we have a vision, a mission. It wasn't only to come out of Egypt, we had to receive Torah. It wasn't only receiving Torah. We have to make our way to the land of Israel, and from there, in the land of Israel, be a light to the nations, build our temple, and our light will shine to the entire world. We have to be gathered around, again, that root to gather. We have to gather around this function of being that central, fulfilling our central purpose of being a light to the nations. Now, as I mentioned, the candelabra itself represents the different branches, represents all of Israel, right? The different spheres in the Kabbalistic understanding. And they're all focused on the central sphere, right, which would be literally, you can look at it as the Ner HaMaravi, known as the Western candle, which would be almost like the Malchut, right? The Malchut connects everything together. It's the vessel. And from there, from the divine presence, as we all know, the Shekhinah is really the Malchut, right? The divine presence will reside amongst Israel. That is really the function of all of Israel, to do our proper service, to bring the divine presence to reside within the temple. And that's reflected throughout the menorah. When Israel leadership is in the proper way, and that's really the purpose of Israeli leadership, right? God wants Israel as a nation to function, to focus on the goal, our vision of being a light to the nations, and following the path of the divine service led by our great prophet, our leaders, our sages that lead us through this, to fulfill the mission, our great leaders. So we all have to work together in harmony, and that's our whole moving in the desert together and focus on our goal. And that's really how the leadership is supposed to be built. But what happened? A great tragedy took place. And this week's portion, Rashi hints to it other portions as well. But when the first sin of those who complained about the way and all that, a fire came out, and the fire struck it says, in the corners of the camp. Who were the corners? One opinion says it was the Kitzon, the Tzinim, the leaders. It was the first group of elders that we see in the book of Exodus, in the giving of the Torah, that there were elders that were already appointed in the past. And those elders were punished. I'm not going to go into the punishment, why they were punished, but they were punished. One of the reasons because it says that they when they were viewing upon the divine presence in a high level, they were eating and drinking, if you recall from the book of Exodus. And those elders weren't punished on the spot, just like Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, were punished later. They were punished also later at that moment when the bad elements sinned of complaining about leaving Egypt and whatever it was, they're complaining about the traveling in the desert. So that the fire came and reached first the leaders in the camp. It first struck them. But here's a hint, the fact that the leadership wasn't working properly. The fact they were punished was, again, when the leadership is disunity and Israel's going in the wrong direction, so therefore that leadership had to be replaced. And that's why God said to Moshe Rabbeinu, gather again 70 elders, and now I'm going to place. There it didn't say God placed upon them part of Moshe Rabbeinu's spirit. Here, God actually says, I'm going to place upon them of your spirit now. So it's something that God is saying we need another leadership. The 70 elders represent our Sanhedrin, our court. God is saying we need a new leadership. And this new leadership will be unified together and will bring that blessing to Israel. And that's really what takes place as a result of, as we said, the sin of the Asaf. They were gathered together for the wrong reasons. They were gathered together to fulfill their desires and their children bellies, as we say. They were concerned about their own personal ego. But instead of being concerned about the mission, the goal of why we came out of the land to be a light to the nations, to have the divine presence reside amongst us. And therefore this new set of elders that were now chosen, from each tribe that were chosen, God says now he's going to rest his presence upon them, and he's going to give that spirit of Moshe Rabbeinu upon them. So these are going to be at a much higher level, again, helping us, realize Am Yisrael that must reach that level of divine worship, through our purpose, our function, not doing things for our personal needs. Where all the sins that take place in the desert, of all these things when people are worried about their personal honor and their own ego and their jealousy and all those things, the bad things, that cannot be leadership. Leadership can't come from those bad, character traits. Leadership has to be when everyone realizes that we have a common goal of being a light to the nations, of living a life of Torah, of living a life of love and kindness and giving. Well, nations thinking about their own personal welfare and not about the purpose of our divine purpose, so that's when everything falls apart. And therefore, as I said, Asaf, that is mentioned over and over again in this portion, means to gather. There are two ways of gathering. We can gather together like a unified menorah. A candelabra that's in the temple had to be of gold and totally of one mold, showing our unity. When we are unified like that one mold of the tabernacle, then we will give light, and the divine presence will shine upon us, and we'll be able to fulfill our goal of a light to the nations, of being the nation of Israel in its utmost. But we are gathered together as an Asaf Suf. It's like a double gathering. It doesn't mean the difference how many times you say gathering, but when you gather together for the wrong purposes, your unity is to make disunity amongst Israel, and then everything falls apart. Everything becomes, goes the wrong way, and that's all the crisis we see at the end of the portion. It's showing the two sides. We can either choose to be like the menorah, and that's how God shows our court, right? That's the whole idea of a new leadership. Or God forbid, if we follow our own desires and our personal goals, we're going to end up being, going through crises and terrible tragedies we'll bring upon ourselves. Now, this concept that we just spoke about, I was thinking Asaf reminds me so much about who's Asaf. Asaf is one of the famous Levites. And he's hinted here, I think, if we're thinking about how in the opening of the portion talks about the menorah and then the Levites being inaugurated and the divine service. So there's a great hint to Asaf. There was one of the Levites, his name was Asaf. And if we look in Psalms, he's mentioned in 7 Psalms, just like the branches of the menorah, the candelabra. There are 7 different Psalms within the book of Psalms where we see Asaf mentioned. You can look it up. 50, for example, was one of them. And the reason I'm mentioning now 50, there's also 77, 75, 76, 79, 82, and 83. But the reason I'll start with 50, I'll just mention that now, because the Nun, the 50, as I said, there were 2 letters that were backwards in this week's portion regarding when the ark was traveling. We said it was out of place. But here it's very fascinating. The level of the menorah is the level of 7, right? The level of 7 is the level that God created the world in 7 days. What's beyond the 7 is the 8th level. The 8th level represents beyond nature. It represents us reaching our spiritual goal and height, the redemption. When we go beyond the 7, we are now entering a new phase. And that's why circumcision's on the 8th day, and the 8 days of Chanukah, that's hinting to that. There are 8 garments of the high priest, and we spoke about this in the past. The number 8 is extremely, it goes beyond nature. The number 50 is the same thing, because we have 7 times 7 is 49, where there are 49 days, we counted the Omer, right? And then we reach the level of giving of Torah, is the 50th level. That's the 50th level over here. That's beyond nature. And that's really when the divine presence is shining now in our temple. Because of our work and our unity that we've gathered together, we can bring about that 50th level. And that's really an important thing to connect to. Asaf, this Levite, that 7 times he's mentioned in the 7 branches in the Psalms. We know that there's a famous story where he mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Divrei Yamim. Divrei Yamim, when it accounts the return of the tabernacle, the return of the Ark of the Covenant to the bringing it into the city of David when it was brought over. There's a beautiful account of how that was done in the book of Divrei Yamim. Fascinating. And I want you to all, if you can read it, I think you should read some of those verses. It's brought down in the first Divrei Yamim, number 1, Chronicles 1, chapter 15, verses 14 to 29. It's a few good verses there, but it's fascinating. It talks about Asaph being amongst those that were with the musicians, and the beauty of returning the Ark of the Covenant to the temple. To bring it to King David was wanted in the city of Jerusalem, right? To prepare it for getting close to our building of our temple, of course, by his son Solomon. And that whole account is mentioned in Divrei Yamim, and that reminded me so much of this portion. There, Asaph is one of the Levites that are singing, that's involved in this great event, and the sanctification of Levites to bring the Aron Hashem, The Levites over here, of course, were Levites like Asaph, and there were also the priests who had to carry they were in charge of carrying the Aron, the Ark, and they brought it to the house of Hashem. This great event that's mentioned in Divrei Yamim is really, again, and I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago with King David on the holiday of Shavuot, where the purpose of Am Yisrael is to rebuild build God's kingdom in the land of Israel. And that's through, of course, our temple, and through our Levites, and through our priests, and our Levites and all that. This can only come about when we're unified, and everyone understanding their very, very particular purpose, and not being jealous of other people's purposes, but knowing who you are and how you fit into the picture and the scheme of things. This will bring about our redemption. So this week's portion, to wrap things up, we see how the menorah, the central menorah, the temple so central, located, representing the divine presence, that is really the key, the branches of our understanding, our unity as a nation, that we're all focused around that very, very powerful goal of to gather together to fulfill our purpose, our vision as a nation of being a light to the nations. And when we veer off that goal, we're going to see all the difficult challenges we're going to have. But we focus on that goal, and we gather together, safe in that purpose, to gather together for that purpose, we are going to achieve our goal of being a light to the nations. If we look today in the situation what's going on in Israel, and I can't, again, I sort of been dragging on over here, but I just tried to hope I can stress the important points over here. Is that Israel today is in a huge crisis. We have the same thing repeating itself. You have the political crisis where a lot of people are worried about their own personal ego. The left, very, very, but extreme left, that they're demonstrating to bring down the government and all kinds of things, and just really more concerned about their own personal selves. And then you have the majority of the nation, that are fighting the war and trying to unify for the goal of building the land, of defeating evil in the world. and let Israel go forward to be the great country it is, to be a light to the nations. This is exactly the struggle today. This is repeating itself. And we must be unified around the goal in order for us to achieve our vision and to succeed. And those evil forces just remind us so much about the Erev Rav, those evil forces that want to bring down Israel. And this really requires a great leadership. The leadership that will not rise to the occasion, they will be dismantled, they'll fall apart. Only the true leaders of Israel that will rise to the occasion. They will walk us through this and we will succeed. And we see, we're very encouraged by the message of being like a menorah. And so we have to really focus on that. We know that the state of Israel has that logo as the menorah as part of our logo. And let us live up to that logo of being a menorah and not, God forbid, doing the opposite of being a source of darkness. And that's exactly the struggle today. This lesson reflected on a lot of those points, and I hope I was clear enough. There's so much here. One of the hardest things about giving a teaching sometimes is trying to try to dilute, bring things in a very simple level, just to understand the basic framework. So I hope the message got across. Have a beautiful Shabbat, and let us pray for good things. We need it so badly. Shabbat Shalom. B'Sorah Tova.